Hello, everyone. I'm Mystery.
And I'm Mortimer, the Authenticator, and we are the Duality of Man.
Today, we're talking about the duality of man and art. As I'm sure everybody is aware, some of the world's greatest pieces of art have been created by men. And as men, we also have a very good appreciation for things of beauty, things that inspire, things that move us. So that's what we're going to be talking about today.
I think there's a weird thing, especially in recent decades, where like art is seen as the almost universal domain of femininity or womanhood. And I find that to be odd when you consider how many artisans and craftsmen there have been over the millennia. Um, and I also kind of want to talk about not just art in general, but the way art has been viewed and how that has changed, and how I'm not entirely certain that that's a good thing, because I don't think I'm going to be very controversial when I say that, especially in the last 20, 30 years, art has gone downhill, but quickly. And if you want to zoom it out even further than that, comparing the art from 200 or 300 years ago to the art made in the last 100 years or so, like even just in terms of the ratio of output of like good quality art versus shit, um, it's gone down significantly, and I think part of that is the way we've taken to viewing art, both as a as a general society, but also in like a formal academic sense, because there's a dichotomy brewing in modern day sort of art discourse, and I do say a dichotomy. A lot of people have glommed onto the fact of how detrimental um, the Frankfurt School approach has been, that has given us things like Dadaism, Surrealism, Postmodernism, etc. But honestly, it, it's more alarming even than that is, I think, the way we've chosen to go about opposing it or trying to fix it, which it seems like the modern artist dichotomy is, on the one side you have the Frankfurt School, um, the Frankfurt School art as a means to a socio-political and moralistic end approach that is bad. Don't get me wrong, it's bad. But on the other side, the side that's nominally in opposition to those things, you have the Jungian archetype school of thinking, where everything has to be subservient to its broader, like, societal and moral impact. And I'm looking at this from the outside, going, do you guys not see how that's two sides of a extremely flawed dichotomy? Like, don't get me wrong, the Frankfurt School approach, as with so many things that have gone wrong in the most recent centuries, has its roots in Hegel's approach of the historical dialectic. That's where the terms modernism, pre-modernism, and postmodernism even come from, is Hegel's historical dialectic. But if the only countervailing mentality is my Jungian archetypes, I that it doesn't strike me that that like fixes the problem. It sort of just seems like the same dichotomy, but on the opposite team. In one side, you weaponize everything based on sort of broader, almost platonic approaches to things, which is the Frankfurt School approach of everything is a means to an end, everything is about socio-political and moral impact. And then on the other side, you've got the Jungian approach that does the exact same thing, just with like a slightly more academic, slightly more traditionalistic, and slightly more like psychological overlay. But it still treats art like a means to an end rather than an end in itself. And one of the things I've noticed from my studies of art, which was for the briefest of times when I was in school for philosophy, that was my that was kind of my specialization. My two specializations were um, philosophy of life, i.e., the philosophy of sort of lifestyles, what the Greeks referred to as the dyada, the lifestyle, um, and then the philosophy of art itself was also kind of my specialization. So I've done I've done many hours of research before and after going to school for it about the nature of art and the different approaches throughout history of art. And I find it odd that of all the things we've lost over the course of the last few centuries, the thing we've lost the most is the idea that things are valuable for their own sake rather than as a means to an end.
Yeah, I feel like when you look at a painting, like a lot of classic paintings, I don't know about so much necessarily modern paintings, but when you look at like, I say, The Last Supper by Leonardo da Vinci, like my thought was the fact that it is a beautiful painting is all the reason that it needs for its existence.
Yeah, and it's not even like that. That's the other problem I have with the Jungian approach. It's been inculcated with and impregnated with all this traditionalist baggage of like it has to be my Christian values and my very strict morality in order to be any good. And it's like, no. Even in like the golden age of like religious fervor, a lot of the subject matters of paintings and sculptures and things of that nature were were strictly outside of the religious orthodoxy of the day. I mean,
Yeah,
you
there are a
had
lot of paintings based upon like folklore, like stories that people like would be told, like passed down through their cultures, and people would make paintings out of them. That wouldn't
yeah,
necessarily adhere to, say, Christian values. And I don't think art really needs to, because to me, art is about the capture and expression of beauty. So, like, you could paint like a nature scene, and it could be very beautiful, but that has no necessarily Christian values to it.
right. And I would go one step further and just say value in general because even putting it in terms of beauty might somewhat be limiting because there is, for lack of a better word, beauty or value in things that are deliberately unbeautiful. For example, like one of my all time favorite artists is William Blake, Sir William Blake, and he was a Gothic Romanicist from the 1800s or so, and many of his paintings were paintings specifically of hell or demonical imagery. Another great artist that even more recently than that was a woman by the name of Rosaline Norton. She earned herself the nickname the Witch of King's Cross because she would use um, esotericism and occultism to inspire her art. She painted paintings of figures like Pan and Lilith and Lucifer and a lot of other, again, strictly speaking, not beautiful or deliberately unbeautiful things. And yet, there was more value in one of her paintings or one of William Blake's paintings than I'm just gonna say it. Basically anything that's been produced in the last 50 years. Um, and I kind of end up chalking it up to worldview because um, for all that the Jungian approach has its uses, I mean, without the Jungian approach, we wouldn't have Star Wars, we wouldn't have any of the other pieces of art that were deliberately meant to evoke Joseph Campbell's monomyth. So the Jungian approach has its uses, and I would go so far as to say even as much as I hate the Hegelian approach to well fucking everything because I will maintain until my dying day or until someone makes another argument for me that basically everything that's gone wrong in the last 200 years philosophically can either be tied directly to Hegel or can be tied to someone like Marx, Engels, or the Frankfurt School itself, who is
Wasn't
being
Marx a fan of Hegel?
yes, that's what I was getting around to. Either you can tie things that have gone wrong philosophically directly to Hegel, or you can tie it to someone who may have disagreed with Hegel superficially on particulars, but nevertheless was operating within Hegel's presented framework, especially his um, dialectical view of complex systems. He was applying it explicitly to history, but you can swap history for literally fucking anything, and the flaws with the Hegelian approach will still be made apparent. For example, Marx and Engels just took Hegel's thesis and antithesis dichotomy, swapped it out for specifically economic elements, which wouldn't have even necessarily been opposed to Hegel's approach. It would have just been more specific. And then you've got the bourgeoisie and the proletariat and so on. Or you can take it one step further, like the Frankfurt School did, and you've got both economics and history and culture and arts and every other. Basically, the only innovation really of the Frankfurt School was it took the dichotomy that Hegel gave Western philosophy and just went and applied it to everything. And funnily enough, a lot of people don't know about the history of the Frankfurt School. The Frankfurt School was a uh, joint joint effort between French philosophers of the 19th and 20th centuries and German philosophers of the 19th and 20th centuries. And they explicitly made it because a lot of intellectuals got back from World War One, and they were so shell shocked, so broken neurologically, that they assumed that no civilization with any intrinsic value could possibly have created something like World War One. And so they began to create philosophies that either didn't require any intrinsic value to operate within, or were actively opposed to the concept of intrinsic value because they viewed the concept of intrinsic value as part of the problem. And as I pointed out earlier, most people know, largely due to people like Jordan Peterson, but nevertheless, most people at this point know the concept of postmodernism. That concept came directly from Hegel's historical dialectic. He viewed all of civilization as existing within the three phases: pre-modern, modern, and postmodern. The problem is there was no evidence that postmodernism as a organic, natural thing would ever come to exist. But he insisted that someday history would just stop happening and that all dichotomies would ultimately be shown to be shit, and that we would eventually move to a place where no dichotomies existed whatsoever. I, Ironically, however, his entire framework was dependent on there constantly being a series of dichotomies. Hence the problem. But anyway, we got a bit far afield of art by talking about the particulars of it. The thing is, in the old days, i.e., Jungian archetypalists might want to lay claim to being the most traditionalist of art approaches, but in the actual old days, art was number one viewed as an end in and of itself, and two, it was viewed to be inspired by something that was non-human, whether that be the muses in ancient Greek and Roman times, whether that be the Fae in more sort of Anglo-Spear-centric periods, or whether that be literally divinity in the case of the Renaissance and the Catholic Church and so on. But regardless of the sort of religious or metaphysics of it, you can still have a non-human approach to art, even without any of the spiritual or religious or metaphysical gobbledygook, because um, we've we've known for a long time, or at least we've postulated for a long time as a civilization, that certain concepts like mathematics or certain inventions um, either come from human intuition, which is not necessarily subject to human will or conscious awareness, or from the idea that concepts sort of exist in a higher realm and they sort of filter down to humanity through our intuition. And regardless of where you want to say this comes from, the point is number one, we've lost art as an end in itself, and we've lost the idea that art is strictly non-human. Um, in modern parlance, everything is subject to human egos, whether that be in the Jungian subconscious sense or whether that be in the everything is a socio-political and moral means to an end of the Frankfurt School variety. And in both cases, I have to say, stop turning something that is strictly non-utilitarian into something utilitarian. Art is not supposed to be a mechanical, like quasi technological means to an end thing. It's supposed to be something you do as an end in itself for its own sake because there is inherent worth in doing it. Um, this is one of the whole this is one of the reasons why I call myself the authenticator, or why I chose that moniker for myself to begin with. Um, Making my way on the YouTubes is because um, we've lost the idea that art and value aren't entirely subjective. Yes, subjectivity has its place in the mechanics of art, but I think we've lost something by saying that that is the only meaningful metric by which things can be judged. Human subjectivity being the only measure of things. I think even if you wanted to claim that, even if you wanted to throw caution to the wind, throw metaphysics to the wind, throw everything else to the wind, human intelligence is subject to things like evolutionary pressures, hence why evolutionary psychology works so well. Um, and also subject to things like causality and logic. Whether that logic be entirely, formalized and entirely like Socratically rigorous or not is not the issue. The issue is whether you like it or not, human nature is a reflection of nature at large, which is subject to causality, reason, and evolutionary pressures. So whether you want to call it rational or not is not the issue. It is to some degree.
So let me ask you something. Do you think it's more important for the author to like express his feelings, like in say romanticism, or do you think that it's better for the um, painter to uh, basically create um, how do I put this? Create just what is rather than what he feels.
I I think I think it's definitely closer to the second one than the first one. I tend to agree with Michelangelo to some degree. Michelangelo is famously and perhaps apocryphally thought to have said, "The sculpture is already in the marble. I just chip away the superfluous bits." Um, and I think while you can make existential arguments as to whether that's objectively true or not all the live long day, I think we've lost something by completely foregoing that way of thinking. The idea that the art is more important than the artist. Again, whether it's from muses, whether it's from God, whether it's from um, human nature, intuitively in kind of a independent, spontaneous invention, or Platonic or Pythagorean sort of way. You can there are many roads that lead to this metaphorical Rome. In many ways you can get there, but I think where we've gone wrong entirely is we've lost that way of phrasing it to be just full stop at all. Like it's gotten to the point now where if you phrase something as though the thing is valuable in and of itself, you will be called childish and naive. Um, Everything has to be utilitarian, whether it's utilitarian in the socio-political sense, like the modern day social justice approach, or whether it's utilitarian in the it has to serve my higher morality and my society, as with the Jungian approach. Um,
But let me ask you something. Do you think that we have a problem in modern art of people attempting to assign value to something that has no value? Because there was this one, I believe it was a prank where this guy put his glasses down on the floor of an art gallery, and people like were surrounding it, trying to interpret what the artist's meaning were, and then the guy comes up, picks up his glasses, puts them on, and walks out.
well, there's many cases like that. I think one of the first and most egregious on record is a guy by the name of Marcel Duchamp, who is basically the example of everything wrong with modern art, in my opinion. He um, broke into a public bathroom, chipped a urinal out of the wall, flipped it over, and put the resultant inverted toilet in an art gallery. Um,
And the point of all that was,
to basically prove that intrinsic value was not a thing, and that um, art was entirely subjective and entirely utilitarian slash nihilistic. Again, I kind of call him the if Hegel is patient zero of everything that went wrong in modern day philosophy, Marcel Duchamp is probably patient zero for everything that went wrong in modern art. Um, and I don't even necessarily think the idea of things being projecting meaning where there is no meaning is the issue. I think it's just the avoidance of finding meaning, period, that's the problem. Because while these people say, I can project whatever meaning I want to onto X, Y, and Z thing, in practice and in like their own framework, they don't even think that's what they're doing. They think that meaning itself is some kind of delusion. So they literally admit to deluding themselves because there's no difference between the delusion of meritocracy or intrinsic value and whatever delusion I emotionally happen to be affected with at this particular moment. Um, Compare that to the olden days, where you have um, the value being inherent in the thing and being inherent in the craftsmanship you apply to the thing. Um, I again, it's not that I want subjectivity to be murdered or anything, although I have occasionally referred to subjectivity as my personal Balrog because I think it has gone too far to a ludicrous degree. But I think if we're just going by the results here, the results of the approach whereby the value is contained in the art itself and the artist is a tool for the art to be conveyed rather than the other way around, where the art is nothing but a tool and the artist's ego or the utilitarian purpose is the only reason why we do things. um, I think I would put up any piece of art created from the old school mentality of the art is valuable for its own sake, with, in comparison to the art is only valuable as a means to an end approach any day. And I'm pretty sure the old school is going to win that one. Not because traditionalism is necessarily better, and in fact, modern day traditionalism is a fairly modern approach in the same way as I consider the Jungian approach and the Frankfurt School approach to kind of be two sides of the same dichotomy. The dichotomy where everything is a utilitarian means to an end. Um, the actual traditional approach involves the art being seen as valuable for its own sake, craftsmanship being seen as valuable for its own sake, and if you were good at those things, if you were basically a good filter, if you were a good array, art used to be kind of viewed similar to a radio picking up a signal, where you were supposed to pick up on something that was higher than human standards and filter it down into the material world. Whereas now it's basically considered like almost a assembly line, or even just a what do they call them? Rube Goldberg machine.
Yeah, I mean, I truly believe that art used to have a lot more depth, both depth in terms of skill and also subject matter. I mean, in regards to skill, I mean, do you think that there is maybe a single artist today that could maybe recreate, say, uh, Saint George and the Dragon by Raphael? Like, if you were asked them to paint that subject matter, do you think it would come out to nearly anything as good?
No, and I don't even think you have to go back that far. I mean, I was watching, of all the embarrassing things, old cartoons recently. I was watching um, Disney's Gargoyles from the 90s and Recess, also by Disney from the 90s. And I came to this rather disturbing conclusion whereby cartoons from the 90s and early 2000s were more well rounded, mature, and substantive than modern day dramas. Like compare Disney's Gargoyles to the Rings of Power, or even like House of the Dragon. And maybe I'm being nostalgic, but I I I think it's, while I do think there's nostalgia for those times, especially in our generation, um, especially lately, I think it's a perfectly justifiable question to wonder, how is it so easy to get nostalgic for the old days? And the answer has nothing to do with psychological confirmation bias or anything. It has to do with the fact that mathematically, qualitatively, the standards have gotten lower, to
Yeah,
where old
but
cartoons had more maturity and well-roundedness to them than modern day dramas.
yeah,
And that's not the right way around.
I mean that's because people actually cared. Like people would say, "We're making this cartoon. We're going to make the best thing possible that we can make. We are going to put our best effort into it." But now it's just company putting out, "Hey, here's a product. Please consume."
Well, it's not. I don't even think it's entirely a product, because there are so many people who make moralistic, abstract arguments for modern day art and why modern day art is quote unquote better, despite all of the, again, fairly objective, like inarguable metrics to the contrary. Um, and it's because the modern day artistic approach is everything is a means to an end, whether that end be Frankfurt School type, where it's socio-political and moralistic, or whether it be Jungian, where it's um, utilitarian and societal and moralistic. Either your choices are either there is no meaning, so we can do whatever we want, or there are these explicit meanings that have to do with tradition and morality, and if you sin against those, you've automatically created bad art, no matter how many examples there are to the contrary. And sort of my red pill moment on Jungian approach not being the solution we thought it was I don't know if anyone is familiar with the YouTuber Professor Geek, but he when the Joker movie came out, um made a series of videos where his argument was essentially Joker Joker 2019 is a bad movie because the trickster archetype that the Joker symbolizes or is supposed to symbolize is overrepresented in our society in this day and age. And I listened to that and I listened to that and I listened to that because he made a bunch of videos about this. Um and it rang so wrong and so diametrically opposed to the solution, and I couldn't quite put my finger on why. And then it hit me when I was listening to the usual journalistic approach of everything as a means to an end, and it was like this eureka moment of, oh, they're saying the same thing, they're just pointing their social compasses in different directions. And it occurred to me that regardless of which way you're pointing the fallacy, um, they're both wrong because they're both trying to turn something that is supposed to be valuable for its own sake into some utilitarian piece of technology. Um, and neither of these is an actual solution because for all of the Jungian approach of we are the ones who speak for the traditionalism, the actual traditions, as I've outlined several times now, have nothing to do with my social values, my morality, my social cohesion. None of that. It has to
There
do
is
with
something that
art as a means to an end versus art as an end in itself. That's the issue.
there is one comment I want to make regarding the Joker argument that Professor Geek made. The Joker, in my opinion, is not a trickster. In my opinion, that the Joker is just pure chaos because a trickster, at least from what I've read, wants to make people who are high up look like fools.
Yeah.
Whereas the Joker just wants to destroy everybody. Like a trickster would see no point in making a fool out of like a weary peasant because his life already sucks. There's nothing funny about that. It's
Because
just sad.
the world is already doing that. But yeah, this is the other problem with the Jungian approach and why I hate it so much. When you start seeing characters as embodiments of archetypes, you lose their individuality along for the ride. I.e., the Joker isn't cool because he's a trickster. He's cool because he's the Joker. Um, and this is the other thing, and I think to some degree, artists are to blame. Modern day artists are to blame because they've internalized this right along with everyone else. Um, Artists no longer see characters as three-dimensional, albeit non-physical beings that they can care about for their own sake. They see um, they see characters as an embodiment of archetypes or a means to getting this theme across. And I've I've gotten really, really black pilled in just in general over the concept of themes because I think we've messed up our sense of artistic priorities to such a degree that themes used to be at best a secondary thing, i.e., there was the art in itself, there were the characters and the world the characters occupied in themselves, and then if we wanted to, there was also the themes. But now it's gotten completely turned on its head where the themes come first and also the characters in the world building if we can get around to it, fine, Gur. Um and it's gotten, and it goes back to sort of why I dislike both sides, because um number one, themes are unidimensional, i.e., if you say that the purpose of a given piece of art is this theme, then any other meaning that um, a piece of art might have is either accidental or just a mistake. And that to me seems completely backwards. And it also means that the characters the characters' lives, albeit they fictional, don't matter to the artist. Whereas you take somebody, and I'm gonna once again simp for the greatness that is the Dresden Files, because god damn, this Dresden Files is just a great series. And Jim Butcher is a great author. Um One of the reasons I love Jim Butcher so freaking much, apart from just the the book series being awesome in and of itself, is he is a fan of his own work. He's given several interviews with regards to his creative process before, and something that struck me that you'd never hear from a more academically inclined artist in this day and age is someone asked him why he wrote a um particular character a particular way, and he said on different occasions, because that's how the character works, and also because I wanted to see where the story would go if that happened. And that to me, it was startling the first time I heard it, but it was also startling because it shouldn't have been startling, in the sense that a lot of artists in this day and age view themselves essentially as an interventionalist god. Like, they are the ones who create the characters. The characters' lives only matter in relation to how they serve their art author, and so on and so forth. Whereas somebody like Jim Butcher, because he is a fan of his own work and views the characters and the world as having value in and of themselves, he doesn't view himself as entirely in control of the world he makes. He essentially wants to figure out how his own world works,
Yeah, he's
because
like
he go ahead. Sorry.
like Jim Butcher created the world, but once he did it, he viewed the world as moving like organically independent of necessarily his wishes. Like these are these characters, therefore whatever situation is they're in, this is how they would react. So
Yeah,
he's
and
basically
and
saying
it
like I'm
it's
going to like, you know, drop in like something unexpected and then write how they would organically react, not how I would want them to react.
and also, I don't even think it's so far as he created it, because when he talks about how he came up with the idea of Dresden Files, he doesn't he doesn't talk about it as though he's a god creating a world from scratch. He talks about various influences he's had, that, whether they be mythological, whether they be other stories, whether they be D&D, because apparently when he was first creating the characters, he made them D&D character sheets, which is just, I mean, Godspeed Jim Butcher again. But um, it, again, he phrases it as though he doesn't know what's going to happen, but he, as a fan of his own universe, wants to know what happens, and so he ask himself the logical question: what would happen with with this set of circumstance, or this new MacGuffin, or this new plot element, or what have you? I I think it's a matter of Jim Butcher is one of the holdovers from the old school of doing things, which is the characters are beings in their own right to some degree. The world is a world in its own right to some degree. It's not my job to make it, it's my job to report on what I find there, almost.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that's what really makes a great storyteller. But look, I want to. There's something I want to get to because we've already been talking for 40 minutes. I want to talk about one of my favorite pieces of art and
Okay.
what it means to me. Do you know the painting "Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog"?
The name is vaguely familiar, and I'm getting a like loose memory of having seen it once, but it's not something that I've looked at often.
It's a painting, a German romantic painting by Caspar David Friedrich. It's about a young man, standing on a rocky cliff, looking out over an ocean with other rocky formations in it, covered in fog. And to me, what I always got from this painting was that he is tired of of basically his world, and he wants to see what else is out there, which is why he's looking off into the horizon. Like, you see, he's a young man and he's carrying a walking stick, but he has nothing else with him. So I always imagine that it's not that far from where he's from, and so I always got the idea that this guy has gone as far as he can go in the confines of his own piece of the world, and now he wants to
More.
basically,
He
yeah,
wants
he
more.
wants more. And
Um,
that's always resonated with me because I've always basically lived in one place for most of my life, and I've always wanted to, get out there and see more of the world. So this is something that's always identified with me.
yeah, I've often had that same impulse of I whether it's um wanting to actually physically go and travel to different parts of the world, or whether it's always looking for new pieces of history and new like cultures to learn about and stuff. I've always had that um I've always had that impulse too. And I think that in and of itself is something that we've lost. The idea that value is not in me or you or people, it's in the world out there to be discovered. Um, whether that's by naturally existing that way, or whether it's again kind of um the Michelangelo approach of the sculpture's already in the marble. I just have to chip away the bits that are in the way. Um, that's always that quote has always resonated with me. The idea that it's not up to me to decide what art is. It's my job to find it. To whether that be in the realm of physical objects, or whether that be in the realm of ideas and logic. Like when, because I am with my friend the brainstormer of pop culture. We're in the middle of writing um a comic, and oftentimes the most creative ideas we have come not from us trying to even be creative. We ask ourselves the questions of what would make sense here, or how would this work sans our input, basically. Um, and I think the other problem with modern day approaches to art is we confuse randomness or um, difference with creativity, i.e., as long as it's different, as long as it's something no one else has ever thought of before, we automatically praise it as being creative. And unfortunately, I think that some things happen organically because they just make sense to happen. Like certain ideas just fit together. So deliberately doing the thing that deliberately doing something that doesn't make sense for the purposes of creativity doesn't actually create anything because there's nothing meaningful attached to it. Whereas reusing an idea or elements of an idea that's already existed, but doing so in a new, or not even a new, but in a um, unused way, um, is more useful or more meaningful than doing everything that no one else has ever done before. Never mind if the reason they didn't do it before was because it was a bad idea. But in terms of my favorite pieces of art, um, a long, long time ago when the History Channel used to actually make decent documentaries, which tells you just how long ago this was. I came across a documentary called The Habsburg Family Jewels, um, which was about, unsurprisingly, the jewels of the House of Habsburg and the pieces of art that they had commissioned during the reign of their dynasty. And I found myself just awestruck because these were pieces of art that existed only to be pieces of art. And yet, they were all more intrinsically meaningful than, again, basically everything the modern world had ever created. Like, back in the day when people used to actually make treasures, like things that were supposed to just have as much artistic inherent intrinsic value that they could have, whether that was from um, a natural occurrence or whether that was from craftsmanship or more commonly some combination of the two refining each other. Um, those things were the things that used to give me that were very instrumental in how I view art in general, just as a general rule. Um, and one of the things I absolutely love that I really wish we would get back to is the idea of the Cabinet of Curiosities or the Cabinet of Wonders, or what was sometimes referred to in Imperial Russia and Germany as the Wunderkammer or the Wonder Cabinet, um, where you as a intellectual or an aristocrat would search the world over for objects that had intrinsic value, almost like a magical quality to them. And you would collect these things by your travels or by procuring them or having someone else procure them or making them from scratch or what have you. Um, and the quality of your cabinet of curiosities was sort of seen as a reflection on you as a person, and you as a monarch or as a aristocrat or a person of significant standing. And I really, really want Cabinets of Curiosities to make a comeback because, again, just the idea that the art isn't in the artist, the art is in the world. The artist's job is to either find it, refine it, or I guess for lack of a better word, like channel it almost as though they're a medium. Um, like value exists not as a subjective construct, but as a quality in the world that exists. Um, whether it be in the abstract or in the very literal objective sense.
I
Those
think one of the highest
go ahead.
forms of art is art that elevates us, that inspires us to be better versions of ourselves. Like for me, one of my favorite paintings is, as I mentioned, Saint George and the Dragon by Raphael. and it's a picture of a knight slaying a dragon with a lance, and he's riding a horse, and there's like a maiden in the background. And I saw this when I was a kid. I forget where. I think it was in one of my older sister's art books, but I really love this painting, and it inspired me to, I wanted to be more heroic whenever I looked at this painting.
Be like Saint George, fight the dragon, etc. Um, and keeping the theme going, oddly enough, one of my favorite pieces of art. As I said, I'm a massive fan of William Blake, um, and probably his most famous picture, probably his most famous painting, um, largely due to the efforts of one Mr. Thomas Harris in his Hannibal Lecter trilogy, um, is the Great Red Dragon. Um, it's it's a picture of what is essentially meant to be the devil at a like witch's sabbath, and yet again, despite the fact that it's very deliberately grotesque, despite the fact that it's very explicitly gothic, um, it's still mathematically and like artistically beautiful on an inherent level. Um, and again, getting back to someone I mentioned earlier, um, Rosalind Norton, um, her paintings of these figures from mythology, whether it be Pan or Diana or Lilith or Lucifer, it kind of hold the energy of those beings to the point that even the most skeptical among us, which, to be fair, I am not. I'm a practicing occultist with 16 years of experience. So it takes very little to sell me on the idea of divine inspiration or metaphysical inspiration. But I have to believe that even the most skeptical of um, people would begin to at least entertain the notion of divine or extra dimensional inspiration from looking at these pictures.
Yeah, I mean, personally, even as a Christian, I wasn't super into religious artwork, mainly because a lot of it depicts scenes from like scenes from the Bible, obviously,
Yeah,
and like whenever you read the Bible, you always kind of formulate the way things imagine in your own mind, and like the paintings that were done, like the way I saw it in my head looked different from the painting, so it kind of I
yeah,
I didn't like it as much since it was different from my own perception of the stories.
and I think there's a case for that being a problem no matter what the subject matter is if you're limiting your if you inherently limit your perspective. Whereas again, someone like Rosalind Norton, because she is using herself as the channel, as the tool, and she actually believes, for all intents and purposes, that these entities existed and were inspiring her. Um, I think being able to put herself aside and be essentially the tool in someone else's hands um, is makes it more meaningful. Even someone like uh, what the hell is his name? William Butler Yeats. He's famous for having attributed most of his poetry to a fairy creature known as the Lananchi. Um, which, to be fair, the concept of a fairy lover or vampiric fairy who inspires art is nothing new. Um, which is why I always laugh when people say, "Well, Yates made up the concept of the Lananchi," and I'm like, "Yeah, he made up the name, the Lananchi, but the concept of the fairy lover who inspires art is as old as the hills under the hills under the hills." And it's possible, especially considering that Yates was a member of the Golden Fricking Dawn, that he was speaking from his personal experience to some degree, i.e., maybe there really was a Lananchi who inspired him directly. Um, you can see in Yeats's poetry sort of the impact of a a very naturalistic world of the Fae, and even though he was a dyed-in-the-wool Christian, he had a lot of respect for the old world polytheistic, um, naturalistic world of, for lack of a better word, the pagan or the proto pagan period. Um, and when he collected poetry and mythology from bygone eras, he did so in a very respectful manner, even though he didn't entirely believe in these things. I think he sort of backdoored himself into believing it, even if he wasn't consciously aware of it. And you could make the argument even for someone like H.P. Lovecraft doing that, even though, as many of the academics will go ahead and point out, H.P. Lovecraft was a dyed in the wool materialist atheist for his entire life long. Um, I would argue that he also was the child of a mental patient and someone who, if you read the documentation of H.P. Lovecraft's mother, was a very likely candidate for what we would now call histrionic personality disorder, and also that Lovecraft himself was haunted by nightmares of things he called night gaunts from an early age. And one has to wonder, and again, maybe this is just me being my esoteric loving self, that maybe he was a materialist atheist, and maybe he was divinely inspired, or rather, inspired by eldritch things. But those two things don't need to contradict each other, and in fact, they fit quite nicely if you assume that one of the reasons he clung so tightly to materialist atheism was because the only other option was to become one of his own protagonists. To become, Lovecraft himself was teetering on the edge of becoming a protagonist of a Lovecraftian story, and the only way he could weld himself to the material world was to shun that aspect of himself and treat his inspirations like they were directly fiction.
Yeah, I mean, oh, that's what a lot of I believe art. I think a lot of older art, maybe even like prehistoric art in stories was basically trying to make sense of something that you aren't able to understand.
Or were influenced by more so even than that. Because I don't like this in the modern intellectual parlance, there's this idea that the people of the past didn't know anything and couldn't understand anything. Um, and especially knowing what I know about evolutionary psychology and how little our species has actually changed from the time of the Stone Age to now, I don't think that um, I don't think that the prehistoric age was all that long ago or all that distant from here. Um, I think that our ancestors were just as intelligent as we are. They might not have had the same tools as we do, and we should be grateful for having those tools. But to say that, for example, a um, ancient shaman didn't know anything about his field of expertise, or the medieval magical practitioner or the cunning man or cunning woman didn't know her field because it wasn't science, and therefore it couldn't possibly have been valid or meaningful. And to say that all these artists who have claimed to be inspired by gods and muses and fairies and all these other things, to say that none of them were sane or lucid or um, sane or lucid or grounded in reality because their um, philosophy of life was different or because they actually embraced these metaphysical things rather than shunning them in a materialistic sense
Yeah,
is childish. And again, maybe we owe more to our to paraphrase a Disney movie, our friend on the other side than we would entirely be comfortable with. Whether it
yeah,
be the muses, whether it be the fae, whether it be gods or capital G God or whomever, maybe we've had more help as a species than we want to believe in our modern arrogance of no, we know everything, and it turns out the world is nothing but dead matter and nothing more. Her, der, der.
yeah.
Um,
There's no way all of these people were tripping on shrooms.
and even if they were, there's a theory that says a lot of human beings' higher functions were caused by essentially our neurology growing exponentially because we discovered um, psychedelic substances. It's called the stoned ape theory. And while there are aspects of the stoned ape theory I don't entirely buy, we've done modern day studies on psychedelic substances, and it turns out that they can repair damages and holes in the brain or cause new synapses to grow where there weren't any previously. So if that be true, every prehistoric or Neolithic culture, one of the wisest people in their societies were the shamans, and from what we know now and from what we can still tell from shamans that still exist, they were spending a hell of a lot of time high on various psychedelics.
Yeah. Um, Getting back to our another painting I'm going to talk about is Sir Galahad by George Frederick Watts. I believe this was made in the
Um,
1800s, and it just depicts Galahad as a young knight with a white horse. He's got his sword and shield. He's got his helmet laying on the horse, and he's not really doing anything. He's just standing there, but like just the way he's painted, you get a sense of, I guess the word would be purity. If you're familiar with the
well, yeah,
Arthurian
he is
legend,
he is
Galahad was
the
the
Grail Knight.
perfect knight.
He is the one who finally finds the Grail because he was pure enough to find it.
Yeah, and it just feels like this guy could face down the forces of evil, but not be tainted by them at all. And like he's like this is like another figure that inspired me. Like I wish that I could be, that uh, pure of a person.
I'm sure anyone listening to this is by now sensing themes. My points of reference are all caked in magic and mysticism, and yours are very much caked in sort of medieval romance uh, nobility, which probably says something about the way we view art. That both of us kind of lean into the old school, but not necessarily moralistically traditionalist um, approaches to art. Um, it probably does say something about us, but honestly, I think it also says something else because I was trying to think of ways to express my views on art earlier while I was in the shower, and it occurred to me that my approach to art is very similar to my approach to a lot of things, which is when people give me a dichotomous choice and both have the dichotomy have obvious glaring flaws, my standard approach is surely there must be other options, and if you won't give them to me, I'm going to find them for myself. Because, I mean, this is of course a men's rights show, and I think a lot of people in the men's rights movement, by just necessity, are very atypical, very defiant people. Because when we're offered the options of, okay, your options are either modern day feminism with all of its foibles, or extremely traditionalistic gynocentrism with all of its foibles. People in the men's movement are the kind of people who go, why don't we just care about the men again? Does someone does nobody have an answer to this? Because that's the other thing. When you see sort of the beginnings of the false dichotomy, either people get offended by you looking for other answers, or they basically tell you there are no other answers and you just need to suck it up and pick one. And I'm sorry, but surely there must be answers other than worship the women because traditionalism or worship the women because feminism. Could we perhaps find a middle ground where it involves like caring about men? Just a little bit is all I'm saying. And in the same way, it's like with art, either art is a means to an end because Jungian archetypes, or art is a means to an end because socio-political and moral woo, or maybe it's not a means to an end? Question mark. Like again, these seem like very obvious answers to me, and yet they're the only answers you're not allowed to propose ever. And I have to wonder how much of that is just because no one has tried, or because we've all collectively decided that we're smarter than those answers. I.e., instead of asking the question, you know, are there answers other than the ones we've decided we have to choose between, we just mock those answers and then reinforce the um trolley problem choice of either you get shot in the foot or you get shot in the heart. These are your only two options. And if you question whether you need to be shot at all, we're going to laugh at you and mock you and probably call you immoral.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things about art, true art, is that I think when you're looking at something that you know to be a piece of or to be a piece of art, its value is self-evident. Like as you mentioned before,
Yeah,
like you don't need to wonder about what it necessarily means because like it will present its meaning to you.
yeah. It's very real art is very loud, and I've been a collector of antiques for most of my life, which again probably says more about me being fucking weird than it does about anything else. But um, and that is something that I've noticed. Even things that were designed for a utilitarian purpose back in the day also had artistic value. Like looking at even something as modern as a gramophone record player. Yes, it was meant to, function in the sense of playing records, but it also has value and beauty and artistic worth in addition to, and almost over the top of, its utilitarian function. And this is actually a fairly this idea that things can either be functional or valuable is a very new and modern thing. Like even back in the 20s and 30s, you had the Art Deco movement where, in addition to something's, you know, practical functionality, it was also supposed to have artistic value and artistic worth unto itself. Um, I think it speaks more. and more to sort of what we've lost as a civilization, that now we view artistic value as almost childish or delusional or naive, to the point that if something has aesthetic value in addition to its function, we almost try to destroy its artistic value and ask questions like, why did they bother making it look pretty? Why didn't they focus only on the function it's supposed to serve? Um, that and far be it from me, but given that the greatest feats of human civilization have usually been as a result of believing something was valuable for its own sake rather than as a means to an end, maybe our modern need to make everything a means to an end, everything utilitarian, everything functional instead of valuable, maybe we went wrong somewhere.
Well, I think, I mean, I agree with you. You definitely went wrong somewhere. And I feel like we are being told, instead of like the value of something being evident, we're being told it has value. But when we look at it, like nothing comes to us. Like recently, like well, not recently, just a couple years ago, but like I went to an art gallery and there was like some modern art pieces, and the person, like the curator, was telling me what this is supposed to mean. But like when I looked at it, I felt nothing.
That
It was
it
completely
wasn't,
empty.
the art wasn't saying anything. It was a void to be projected upon, basically.
Yeah, well, it's like you create a thing and then you say what it's supposed to represent rather than creating a thing that represents something in and of itself.
Or letting yourself be the tool for something to be created, because again, in the old days, the artist was kind of seen as part servant of art and part, again, almost like a psychic medium channeling something from higher dimensions or whatever you want to call it. Um, and I do wonder how much of modern day artists being abjectly miserable and often very self loathing and very self defeating has to do with the fact that they want art to be an ego trip rather than a service role.
I think it's
I.e.,
also because that they're not truly creative. Like they wish they were. They wish they had the genuine creativity to make something that could inspire people, but they just don't. And so they're just faking it,
well,
hoping that one day they'll be
I
able to
think
make something.
there's the other half of that, which is there are artists in the modern world. Neil Gaiman is probably the perfect example, who do have the capacity to inspire people. But because they can feel on some level that it doesn't come from them, that it does transcend them, that it is above them, that their art is more meaningful than the artist who made it, they grow to resent that. Because one of the last like modern pieces of art to ever inspire me was Neil Gaiman's run of the Sandman. Um, and even then, the ending of the Sandman is terrible because you can feel that Neil Gaiman, rather than letting the story conclude itself organically, insisted that the art serve his end, namely the end of not wanting DC to screw around with his character after he was done with it, so he killed the character off. And you can almost feel that same resentment in the modern day Sandman adaptation for Netflix, because rather than see himself as a servant of art or as a servant of, in his case, the Lord of Dreams, um, Gaiman insists that he is the prime mover or the secret sauce that makes the Sandman worthwhile, instead of, again, the possibility, and I do genuinely think that there is a possibility that he had some help from the other side, namely that there is an entity known to be the Lord of Dreams, sometimes called the Neros, sometimes called Hypnos, sometimes called Somnus, etc., who possibly inspired Neil Gaiman's run of the Sandman in the same way that the Greek gods and the muses always were thought to inspire art back in the old days. And yes, while that makes me sound very hippy trippy and very woo woo to say that um, that I do think there's genuinely an entity that's analogous to the Lord of Dreams who genuinely inspired a comic book in the 80s. Um, I still think it's true. And I'm not going to stop thinking it's true just because I get shamed or treated like a woo woo. Because I think that whether Neil Gaiman wants to admit it or not, he had help. And the reason why he can't touch those same heights again is because he went and pissed off whatever was helping him. And this is Neil Gaiman trying to touch the realms of the gods without their help this time. Okay, welcome
Yeah,
back.
sorry. My VPN decided now would be a good time to disconnect and reconnect.
Isn't technology great?
Well, we've been going on for an hour and 16 minutes, so do you want to end it here before I have more technical difficulties?
I suppose so. Because again, isn't technology great? But yeah, I realize that a lot of this came off as very woo woo and very um sort of iconoclastic and very um sort of contrarian. And I'm not saying that there's no place for the Jungian approach or even the Frankfurt School approach or the subjectivist approach. But I am saying that in the modern world, I see those as seemingly the only valid approaches. And in so doing, I think we've lost something. And we've lost an entire framework, an entire way of looking at art that is not utilitarian or functionalistic, but is um, intrinsic, is art as a um, thing in itself. And I think art is poorer for it. And I think we are also poorer for it. And I refuse to let that go without a fight. If I have to spend every waking breath I have left saying we should view things as a thing in themselves rather than a means to an end, I will, because I genuinely believe that that is something we need to do if we want to ever rise to the ranks of making good art again. And if I have to be a crazy woo woo to get it done, then I guess I'm okay with being a crazy woo woo.
Yeah, a lot of things are being made now that are contemporary, but we need to make things that are timeless, things that have a lasting impact, things that you could pick up, read 50 years later, and still feel as strong of a connection to it as the people who first picked it up all those years ago.
Never mind the pieces of art that were made 500 to 1,000 years ago, or even further back than that still have more of an impact than things that were just made yesterday.
Yeah. But anyway, let's end it. I have been Mystery.
I have been Dalton Mortimer, the Authenticator, in probably uh, my most iconic role here, and we have been the Duality of Man. Cheers, guys.
Bye, everybody.